Okay, so you have a paper in front of you and a title on the screen that has someone else's name on it. I have a long tradition of working on papers without putting my name on them. So this is another one of these papers. The origin of this paper, as Ajay was saying, lies in absolutely huge debate that erupted in October of 2012. But since a lot of you don't know any of the background, let me sort of ease into this slowly. Basically, this is an analysis of perhaps the most famous macroeconomic and important macroeconomic paper that's appeared in the past decade. All right, so the paper is about forecasting errors, and before the global financial crisis, forecasting was pretty easy for just about anyone, and the reason was because the world had entered into what was then called the Great Moderation, which meant that they seemed to have abolished the business cycle. Growth was high and steady in just about every country. Inflation was low and steady. So if you have that combination, it becomes really, really easy to forecast. And nobody really even talked about forecast errors. But ever since the global financial crisis, forecasters have been making very, very large errors, and repeatedly, always in the same way. They've been consistently overestimating growth. And it's become a sort of fun ritual. Every 6 months, the IMF has a meeting where everyone from the world attends, all the finance ministers and central bank governors attend. And at that meeting, the first thing that the IMF says is, oh, we're really, really sorry that our forecast, we're going to have to mark it down because it was too high. And this game goes on every single time the past 6 months, ever since the global financial crisis. Now, there are three broad theories about why we've run into this problem. And one is that we've underestimated the balance sheet constraints holding back growth. That's a sort of fancy way of saying that something has gone wrong. The corporates are under tremendous stress, or the banks are under tremendous stress, and they have to fix their own problems before they can start investing and the economies can start growing. That's one theory. Basically, that the global financial crisis ruined the banking sector and in some countries the corporate sector, and we still haven't got out from under that mess. The second prominent theory is secular stagnation. There are two variants of secular stagnation. In this one that I put up on the screen, I'm talking about the collapse of productivity. So that's to say the idea there was that there was very good growth in the early mid-2000s because there was a lot of innovation and countries were deriving the benefits of the IT revolution. But those benefits have largely been exhausted, and so growth has slowed. And it's going to likely to remain slow for some time. The third idea was that no, the problem is just aggregate demand is weak. And that's just an idea that Olivier Blanchard, who was the chief economist of the IMF, believes very, very strongly in. And so he, ever since these forecast errors started to materialize, he was determined to prove that this was the problem. And so he started to look at the data, and he discovered something absolutely remarkable. And I've put this discovery up on the screen. I know you can't read it too well. Certainly I can't read it. This shows you this shows you for the euro area. On the y-axis, you have the GDP growth forecast errors. And on the x-axis, you have the projected fiscal consolidation. So in other words, the countries which tried to cut their budget deficits wound up with the worst growth performances, even relative to what was being forecast. Right? Now, it's just remarkable how good the fit is of a line like this. And the reason why it's so remarkable, if you think about it, is that there should actually not be any relationship between planned fiscal consolidation and growth forecast errors. Because by definition, planned fiscal consolidation is known. So it should be incorporated in the growth forecast. There shouldn't, I mean, growth might be higher than forecast, growth might be lower than forecast, but there shouldn't be a systematic relationship between your forecasting error and something that you knew at the time of the forecast. That makes no sense. The only way that you can understand something like this is that if the forecasting technique is wrong, that you're not using your information efficiently, and you're using it in a biased way. So if what happens is that you know that there's fiscal consolidation and yet you still overestimate growth, that means that the fiscal multiplier that you use, which is the sort of variable that goes between consolidation and growth, that multiplier must be too low. That you thought that the fiscal consolidation would have a small effect on growth, even though you should have actually used a much larger number and put in your forecast that it would have a large effect on growth. And that's the bottom line of his paper. And so specifically what he found was something absolutely truly shocking, that for every 1 percentage point increase in the projected fiscal consolidation, there was a 1 percentage point growth forecast error. That's basically the slope of the line that I showed you earlier. And what that means is that the forecasters used a multiplier that was way off, right? They use a multiplier about I put 2 3/4, that's a typo. It should be 1 3/4. They used a multiplier of about 3/4. The real multiplier was about 1 3/4, right? That's a huge, huge mistake. And when he originally published this in the fall of 2012 in the World Economic Outlook that was published at one of these 6 monthly meetings of the IMF. And I was there when the publication was released, and it was like a shock wave was felt throughout the building. There was one article in the Financial Times that said, "There is nothing more powerful than an idea whose time has come." And finance ministers were absolutely bowled over by this reaction. Some of them were furious because it was an implicit criticism of the policies that they've been pursuing, particularly in Europe. There were a lot of arguments, there was a lot of drama, but in the end, the finance ministers backed down in the face of this evidence, and they changed their policies. So that's why I called it at the beginning, saying that this was probably the most important paper of the decade. It was important because the finding was dramatic, and the reasoning was very elegant and spare. You can summarize it very easily. There was some academic rigor. They took They took their time. They actually were very careful and didn't publish the paper until 2013, even though they had their findings already out in 2012. And it had a major, major policy impact, as I just said. So of course, you know where I'm headed. I'm going to attack this paper, right? The most influential policy paper of the past decade, and I'm here to tell you that it's wrong. Okay, all right. So let me. I need to go slowly and carefully over my argument.
Just checking. Were you a team member of that paper?
I was not a team member of the paper, but I obviously, sorry, I should have explained this. I was in the research department of the IMF at the time, and I was there when all of this was happening, and the person who discovered the relationship was, of course, not Blanchard. It was the other guy, Leigh, right? That's the way it always works in the world, right? And Leigh is a good friend of mine, but he was wrong, okay? And Blanchard was wrong, even though Blanchard hired me, but that still doesn't make him always right. Now, but it's one reason why I'm not putting my name on this paper. Now, all right, so there are two questions that you can ask, right? One is, was the finding correct? Can we replicate the result, right? And the second question I want to ask is the interpretation of the finding correct? All right? All right, so the answer to the first question is really simple. I'll do it on one slide. The results are perfectly replicable. So I don't want to, you don't have to stare too hard at this slide. You can just trust me because it's not really the point here. We used the 2012 data. We went back and we replicated things using the 2012 data, splitting the sample different ways. And then we also used the 2016 data, and we did that because, of course, there have been large data revisions since 2012, even for historical data. Blanchard's work really focused on what happened between 2009 and 2011. And believe it or not, since in the intervening years, the data has been revised pretty radically, even since you would have thought in 2012 the data would be pretty final, but it turns out it wasn't. It doesn't really matter. In a way, it strengthens. You can look at, take a look at the last line of that table, or the first line. The first line gives you their one coefficient of 1 that I mentioned earlier. And if you do it with 2016 data on the euro area, you get 1.48, which is an even stronger coefficient. Okay, I don't want to go through this too much because really not the point. The point is results are replicable. The second question is the interesting one, right? Is the interpretation of his finding correct? And there are two reasons why I want to argue that the interpretation is wrong. And I want to argue it because the first point is that if you play with his data some more, you get results that are inconsistent with his interpretation. All right, so here's one that I want to show you. So if you what this shows is this is a regression of the growth forecast error on projected consolidation, and you see that look at the first line, the higher the consolidation, the more there's a negative growth forecast error, and the coefficient is 1.48. So that suggests, again, that you've really underestimated the multiplier. and that's if you look at this is if you do it using the spring 2010 forecasts. So what Blanchard did was he used the spring 2010 forecasts. He was sitting in 2012 and he was looking at what had been done in spring 2010 and then looking at the outcomes for 2010 and 2011. All right? So if you look at the spring 2010 forecast, you see that yes, there is this association between projected consolidation and forecast errors. You see that same thing happening again in 2011. Now in spring 2012, now remember this is before he's published even the box in the wheel. The box in the wheel was published in late 2012, right? But in spring 2012, you don't see any, the coefficient on projected consolidation essentially disappears. It becomes close to zero and it's not significant. So what that seems to suggest is possibly that maybe they made mistakes in 2010 and 2011, but they didn't make mistakes in 2012, even before Blanchard told them that they had made a mistake, right? That seems a little bit odd. Okay. Much more worrisome is if you look at the forecasts that were made in spring 2010 for consolidation going through 2011 or through 2012 or to 2013 or through 2014, because the IMF makes 5-year forecasts, right? If you look at the shorter term consolidations, there's a link, the minus 1.48 that we keep seeing. But if you look at the longer term forecasts, the coefficient is not significantly different from zero, which suggests that they made bad mistakes on the short-term multipliers, but they didn't make any mistakes on the long-term multipliers. Now, how can you do that? Normally, it's much easier to forecast in the short term than the long term. Okay. Now but that's just reasons to sort of wonder a little bit, okay? Now, the basic thrust that I want to really pursue is that he's made a link only between two variables. He's saying, I know what the reason for the growth forecast errors is, and it was one thing that's systematically responsible. And whenever you get a monocausal explanation, you always start to wonder, right? Is this right or not? And so this is what we did. We put higher multipliers, as Blanchard recommended, into the forecast, the short-term forecasts. And we asked, well, what would have been the growth forecast errors if we put the proper multipliers in according to Blanchard? And the answer, as you can see from the red dots, is that the forecast errors would have been large, even with the multipliers that Blanchard suggests. And that suggests that there's something going on besides perhaps multiplier errors. Right? Now, what could have been going on beside multiplier errors? Let's go back to the first table that I showed you. If you look, I've broken things down. Look just at the top 4 lines using 2012 data. I've broken it down into all 26 countries that Blanchard looked at. These were the advanced countries. Look at the last line, euro area. Euro area, you get a coefficient of minus 1.1, which is 1.9, which is about the same the overall. But now look at the non-euro area. The non-euro area, the coefficient is, again, very close to 0. So what you can see from this is that his result derives from really what was going on in the euro area. And we know that something special was going on in the euro area in 2010, 2011, the period that he was looking at.
When you say non-euro area, you mean the whole world other than the euro?
The advanced countries. So
All
US,
PMs
US,
other than-
Canada.
So all of them in some kind of zero interest rate regime, right?
Yes.
So the Blanchard type argument that monetary policy has stopped working at 0 and we need fiscal, that kind of argument could have been reasonably made about the entire
Yes. Right. Right.
what is
Correct.
called non-euro area.
Yes. Right.
So it really is a problem for Blanchard's argument
Yes.
that non-euro area coefficient is 0.
Yes. Because his argument is only applying to the euro countries, whereas his argument was meant to be a very general argument about big multipliers in countries at the zero lower bound and with poor growth and weak demand. Output gaps so that is a problem for his argument, and also it's a problem that you don't get a consistent result across the sample, and it's another problem that his result particularly applies to the euro area when we know that during that period the euro area had a crisis. Okay? Now, and maybe that crisis had an independent effect on the forecast errors that is not in his equation, right? Because his equation is growth forecast error depends solely on your planned fiscal consolidation. There's no other variable for crisis in here. In fact, some of the interest rate forecast errors, one of the ways that you can, how do you measure the crisis? Well, one way to measure the crisis is to look at what you projected for interest rates. And this is, I just took Ireland as an example. This is the projected long-term interest rate for Ireland, which was about 5%. And that's the blue line. And the red line shows you what actually happened. So it shows you that in 2011, interest rates went up to 9%. This is long-term sovereign interest rates. Of course, private interest rates went up much more sharply and to much higher levels. So clearly, there was a forecast error, not just in terms of growth, but in terms of forecasting interest rates in the economy. And the question is, did this forecast error have anything for interest rates have anything to do with the growth forecast error? Right. Another reason why to sort of take a step back and look at the argument again. Let's think about the East Asian crisis. In the fall of 1997, the IMF said that between 96 and 98, Korea would grow by 12%, and it would have some adjustment of its fiscal balance by 0.5 percentage point, right? Now, in fact, GDP did not grow by 12%, it declined by 2% over that period. And in effect, the question that I'm asking is, was that shortfall because they underestimated the fiscal impact of that 0.5 percentage point adjustment? Or was that because they didn't know about the Asian crisis at that point? All right. Now, Blanchard and Leigh, of course, knew that there was a Eurozone crisis. And so they tried to test to see whether the rise in interest rates had an effect on the growth forecast errors. And the way they did this was they looked at the rise in CDS spreads, and they discovered that actually they weren't very important. So they then added a second variable to their equation. And they discovered that no, rise in CDS spreads weren't very important. And that fiscal adjustment basically remained exactly as significant as before. You still get to the conclusion you underestimated the multiplier by 1. So this, if you look at the first line, you see our attempt to replicate that, and what you can see is that the projected consolidation, the coefficient goes down a bit, but it's still significant, and the CDS increase, it's significant in our equation, but the economically it's completely insignificant. Now, if you look at the problem there is that, as I mentioned earlier, the data has been revised. And if you look at the revised data and you run the same regression in the second line using revised data, projected consolidation disappears. It's not significant anymore. All right, so the next step that they said was, well, maybe the Eurozone crisis wasn't an independent event. Maybe it's not right to think of these this way as two different factors, interest rates shooting up and planned consolidation. Maybe the two things were related because the higher interest rates were caused by the fiscal adjustment. And the argument goes like this. Fiscal consolidation depresses growth. Then growth worries make investors worry about fiscal sustainability, and then they run. So everything is in the end explained by the planned fiscal consolidation. The problem with that argument is that it suffers from sequencing problem. So the actual sequence goes like this, that Greece suffered their sudden stop in, remember this, the forecasts are being made in spring 2010. Right? Greece suffered its sudden stop in the last quarter of 2009. After that, the countries formulated their fiscal plans for 2010. Then in spring 2010, the forecasts are made, and it was assessed that the growth was still reasonable. And then the sudden stop occurs. So the sudden stop occurred while people, not just the IMF, but all forecasters, were still projecting reasonable growth. Maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, but the growth projections were still quite reasonable at that point when the sudden stop, when the investors panicked, right? Here's a chart for Greece which shows you the absolutely tremendous degree of the sudden stop that I can't show you all the countries, but that Greece experienced. These are foreign bank claims on Greece. Foreign banks had very, very roughly, you can see from the graph, they had lent Greece about 100% of GDP, and within 2 years, they had taken almost all of that back, right? And foreign bank claims essentially went to zero. So this is a tremendous, powerful on Greece, on Portugal, on Ireland, to lesser extent on Spain and Italy, even to a certain extent on France. You see this, and it wasn't really the result of growth prospects. Is really the result of a deterioration in the structural fiscal balances. So here's an illustration of this. So the top line, the green line, shows you that what the IMF was projecting for Spain's fiscal balances in 2008, which was continued surpluses stretching out as far as the eye could see. In spring 2009, the IMF said, well, there's a deterioration, but things are going to get better over the medium term. They'll bring their budget back into balance. By spring 2010, the IMF had to admit the deterioration is large and it's going to stay large forever. That's really where the action was for all the countries that were hit. Now, if that's the case, then we can treat the sudden stops as an independent event, and that's not caused by the planned adjustment. And what I want to argue is that this is really going to affect the interpretation of the results in this paper. Yeah. Okay. So here's some gobbledygook, but it's actually pretty it's pretty easy. So I'll go through it. The first equation, which I've written very conveniently as equation 5, says the change in output depends on the fiscal balance. So if you have a larger deficit, if you have austerity, you try and correct the deficit, your growth goes down, and if interest rates rise, growth goes down as well. So you have this model of the economy. The growth depends on what you're doing to fiscal policy and on interest rates. And equation 6 just says we know this model, and therefore we use it to make our forecast. That's what the F is. So the forecast error is then 5 minus 6, and that splits down into three terms. One is the forecast change in the fiscal balance, that multiplied by the error in the fiscal multiplier, that's beta minus BF. And then it's also the actual multiplier multiplied by the error that you made in forecasting the fiscal consolidation. And then it also depends on the change in interest rates compared to what was forecast. So you have 3 terms there. And essentially what Blanchard and Leigh are doing is they're only looking at the first term of this. And so you can see that from the perspective of this very, very simple model, they're omitting 2 key variables. And that's going to bias the results very, very badly. In particular, if it's the case that the planned adjustment is correlated with fiscal adjustment forecast error or the interest rate forecast error. In other words, if the variables are correlated in these equations, then omitting 2 of them is going to get you into deep problems. And what I'm going to claim in the rest of the time I have available is that these variables are completely correlated. All right, so now, and I'm going to show you this by taking an extreme example. Let's say the forecasters used the correct multiplier, that they absolutely knew the multiplier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to say that on the basis of certain assumptions, you're going to get a relationship of the type that Blanchard got, even when the correct multiplier has been used. Right? And now he's then going to turn around and use that to claim that people use the incorrect multiplier. Right? Now, what are the assumptions I need to do in order to prove this? I need to assume that I need to make some very reasonable sounding assumptions. First, I want to assume that planned adjustment depends on the existing fiscal balance. In other words, if you've got a large fiscal deficit, you're going to want to reduce it. Right? Sounds plausible, right? The second I want to claim is that the intensity of the crisis depends on how bad your fiscal situation is. That sounds plausible too. And the third thing I want to claim is that countries, when they get into a crisis which is generated by the large fiscal deficits, they're going to try and respond by tightening their fiscal policy. So I make these 4, the first is just a maintained hypothesis. But the three are key plausible assumptions. And I'm going to show you that just using these plausible assumptions, you can get a Blanchard result even if the multiplier is correct. All right, so here we go. The first equation is just the equation that I showed you before, but I've omitted the first term because by construction I've assumed there is no multiplier error, right? So the equation is the growth error depends on the error in forecasting the fiscal balance and the error in forecasting interest rates. And then my equation 1 is the equation that I mentioned earlier to you, that if you have a bad fiscal balance, you're going to try and correct it. Equation 2 says if you have a bad fiscal balance, you're going to get an interest rate attack. And then equation 4 says if you have an interest rate attack, you're going to try and correct the fiscal balance. If you actually plug 1, 2, and 4 into equation 9, I won't show this to you, you can get equation 10. Equation 10 is Blanchard's equation. And I'm not going to prove this to you, but I'm going to hand wave a little bit so that you can see this, right? If you look at the equation 9, you see a term delta fiscal balance forecast, right? That depends in equation 1 on the fiscal balance. Take the other way around. The first term that you see on the right hand side is the delta fiscal balance. From equation 1, you can see that that's linked to the fiscal balance forecast. So then you have the first term that's delta fiscal balance in the first. You've substituted out. You've got the delta fiscal balance for delta FB, and then you've got delta fiscal balance, and then after that you've got R minus RF. But in equation 2, that's related to the fiscal balance. But from equation 1, fiscal balance is related to the delta fiscal balance forecast. So basically what I'm saying is, through substitution, you can get everything on the right-hand side to be a delta FBF. And therefore you get equation 10, which is the growth forecast error depends on the delta fiscal balance that's forecast. So you see, I started with the assumption that the multiplier is correct, and I got the Blanchard equation, right? Even so, what I want to say here is that, okay, you can estimate this equation, you can get a coefficient for lambda, but you cannot necessarily interpret that as a mistake in the multiplier. Under the set of circumstances that I described, which seemed quite plausible, actually this is just association. You cannot possibly interpret this in the way that Blanchard interpreted it. Okay. What I want to do next, and then I'm going to end, is to show that these assumptions that I claim seem reasonable are actually factually correct. So let's start with the equation 1, 2, and 4. The first equation says that the change in the fiscal balance that was forecast, the planned adjustment, depends on how bad your fiscal deficit is, right? So we tested that, and we tested it on data saying we started with your fiscal balance in 2009, like Blanchard did, and we said, how did your structural balance in 2009 affect what your fiscal consolidation plan was for 2010 and 2011? And the answer you can see from the t-values. We did this for going through 2012, going through 2013, going through 2014. Every single year we get basically the same result. For every 1 percentage point by which your fiscal situation was worse in 2009, you planned to have an adjustment of about half percentage point every year. T-values are very high. So yes, indeed, there was a relationship between how bad your fiscal situation was in 2009 and your planned fiscal consolidation. Second equation, was there a link between your fiscal balance in 2009 and the interest rate attack? Yes. First I'm going to hand wave. In 2014, Greece, because of what I just showed you, the reason there was this link was precisely because, as I showed you, the corrections that were planned were very minor compared to the fiscal problems that they had. They were only planning to correct half their problems. So, for example, Greece, they were projecting in spring 2010 that they, even 5 years out, were still going to have a structural deficit of 8.5 percentage point of GDP. All right? So when you make a projection like that, it's really not surprising that the markets panic. All right, now I'm going to show it to you a little more formally, which is that yes, the interest rate errors have a strong link to the 2009 structural balance. If you had a bad situation and you weren't planning to correct it, the markets are going to react badly, and they did during this period. Now let's look at the relationship between the interest rate increase and the extra adjustment beyond what was forecast. The claim is that countries responded to soaring interest rates by stepping up fiscal consolidation. And here's the evidence. Very strong correlation between the interest rate errors and the additional fiscal consolidation that countries did over every single time period. All right, so what I just showed you was two things. First, I showed you that under some plausible assumptions, the Blanchard-Leigh result has absolutely cannot be interpreted in the way that they interpreted it. And then I showed you that these plausible assumptions have evidence behind them. And so what I want to claim is that in fact the interpretation is not correct, and that the problem is that it's only true if the countries that planned large fiscal adjustments in 2009 were a random sample, but they weren't. They were countries with weak fiscal positions, and therefore they were hit hard by the euro crisis, and therefore they suffered huge growth shortfalls. And so that there's a huge omitted variable bias in this presentation. All right. Now one last thing, and then I'll finish, which is okay. But the underlying question was really, was it the fiscal adjustment that killed growth, or the euro crisis that killed growth? So as the last thing I want to do is I want to test that, and I do it by just running a regression of the growth forecast errors on the planned consolidation and on the interest rate errors. And I measure the interest rate errors in three ways: increase in CDS spreads, increase in long-term sovereign interest rates, increase in interest rate forecast errors. No matter how you do it, you see something astonishing. The interest rate increases have large coefficients that are significant, and the planned fiscal consolidations have insignificant coefficients. You can get that with CDS spreads. You get that by using interest rate increases on long-term sovereign debt, and you get that by using interest rate forecast errors. That the effects of the interest rate errors are very powerful, and the effect of the planned fiscal consolidation is not powerful. And so I conclude that, sure, there was an association between planned consolidation and the growth forecast errors, but their interpretation was wrong. It was not that the forecasters underestimated multipliers. It was that they missed the euro crisis. And this has huge implications, because if the multipliers aren't so large, then countries do not need to be as scared of fiscal consolidation as they were in 2012, when they saw the Blanchard and Leigh results and panicked and stopped doing what they were doing. That's